My name is Jasper, and I thought I knew fear. After years of hiking through the most isolated and haunted places, I prided myself on my ability to face the unknown. But nothing could prepare me for Ashen Woods, a forest so steeped in legends and darkness that even the bravest avoid it. I had heard stories, of course dailies of strange figures in the trees, ghostly whispers carried on the wind, and the chilling phenomenon where people would wander in but never return. Yet, despite all the warnings, I decided to visit it. The thrill of uncovering the truth behind these stories was too great. I arrived at Ashen Woods on a late autumn morning. The air was thick with fog, and the trees towered overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The forest felt ancient, as if it had been here long before mankind ever set foot on it. As I began my trek into the woods, a strange silence enveloped me. No birds, no rustling animals, just an eerie stillness that pressed in on me from all sides. As I walked deeper, I began to feel something I hadn't felt before, an overwhelming sense of being watched. Every step I took seemed to echo, bouncing off the towering trunks of the trees. I shook off the sensation, reminding myself it was just my imagination. But the deeper I went, the stronger that feeling became. It wasn't until I reached the heart of Ashen Woods that I truly understood the weight of the legends. There, in the center of the forest, I found a clearing surrounded by twisted, gnarled trees. At the center of the clearing was an old stone well, cracked and overgrown with moss. The air around it felt heavy, almost oppressive, as though something ancient was buried beneath it. I approached the well, my curiosity piqued. As I peered down into the dark opening, I heard it a soft, mournful wail, distant yet unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I stepped back, scanning the trees around me. The wail grew louder, more distinct, like the sound of someone in pain, and then I saw them figures, pale and shadowy, emerging from the mist. They were human in shape, but lacked any features, their faces blank and hollow. They moved toward me with slow, deliberate steps, their bodies shifting unnaturally in the fog. As they came closer, I could hear their voices, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was clear, desperate, pleading. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very ground beneath me had rooted me to the spot. The figures surrounded me, their hollow eyes boring into mine. I felt their presence, their coldness seeping into my skin, and I realized these weren't just spirits. They were trapped, lost souls, forever bound to the forest. One of them reached out, its hand like a skeletal claw, brushing against my cheek. I shuddered, the coldness of its touch burning into my skin. The whispering grew louder, the voices filling my ears, pleading for release. The figure spoke, its voice a dry rasp. Help us. The word struck me like a blow. I shook my head, my heart racing, but the figures did not stop. They circled around me, their hollow eyes still fixed on me, as if waiting for me to do something. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The more I struggled, the stronger their grip on me became, as if the forest itself was closing in. Help us, or join us. The last words echoed in my mind like a death knell. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and I looked down to see roots, dark and twisted, rising from the earth, coiling around my legs. Panic surged through me, and finally, I was able to move. I tore myself away, running without a thought, blindly crashing through the underbrush. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of Ashen Woods, the fog lifting as I emerged into the daylight. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked back, I saw nothing, just the empty, silent trees. But as I stood there, I heard it again, the mournful wail, this time coming from the forest behind me. The lost souls of Ashen Woods were still waiting. My name is Ethan, and I've always been one to seek out adventure. The more remote and unknown, the better. That's why, when I heard about the abandoned trail through Blackwood Forest, I knew I had to explore it. No one had dared to walk it for years, and rumors about strange lights and eerie sounds were enough to pique my curiosity. I arrived at the edge of Blackwood Forest on a crisp autumn evening. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching into the sky. The forest had a heavy, oppressive feel to it, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I wasn't afraid, at least. Not at first. The trail was barely visible, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth and the heavy carpet of fallen leaves. It looked almost forgotten, like no one had walked it in decades. But I was determined. I pushed my way through the brush, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows as I ventured deeper into the forest. As I walked, the woods seemed to grow darker, and the air grew cooler. The trees pressed closer together, and the sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the thick silence. It felt as though the forest was alive, watching me, but I brushed off the unease, reminding myself that I had come here to uncover its secrets. That's when I saw a light dot at first. It was just a faint glow, flickering between the trees in the distance. I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but the glow grew brighter, steadier. It wasn't the light of a campfire, nor the glint of a flashlight. It was too soft, too inviting. Against my better judgment, I followed the light. My curiosity got the better of me. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. But the light always stayed just ahead, dancing through the trees like a beacon. Eventually, I arrived at a small clearing, and there, in the center, was a lantern. It hung from a tree branch, its flame flickering gently, casting an eerie glow around the clearing. I approached it cautiously, wondering who would leave a lantern in the middle of nowhere. The air felt thick, and the moment I stepped into the clearing, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. As I reached for the lantern, the air grew colder, the wind picking up, rustling the leaves with an unnatural force. The flame flickered out, plunging the clearing into darkness. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, but then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a tall, shadowy form, standing just beyond the trees. Its features were indistinct, a dark silhouette against the blackness of the forest. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer, but I could hear something, a soft, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Leave." The whisper was so soft, so faint, I almost didn't hear it. But it was enough to make my blood run cold. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but the figure remained motionless. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Leave, or you'll stay forever." My heart skipped a beat. The words sent a chill through my spine, and I suddenly realized I wasn't alone. The trees around me seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker. The whispering grew louder, and I felt an icy presence at my back. I turned, my flashlight finally clicking on, but the clearing was empty. The lantern was gone. The light had vanished, leaving only the cold darkness behind. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, and as the whispers faded into the wind, I realized that something in Blackwood Forest had been waiting for me, and it wasn't about to let me leave. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I turned and ran. The trail I had followed was gone, replaced by a maze of trees and shadows that seemed to move and shift with every step I took. The whispers followed me, echoing through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. When I finally made it back to the edge of the forest, I didn't stop running until I was safely back in my car. I never spoke of what happened that night, but every time I pass by Blackwood Forest, I can feel the lingering presence of that figure, watching, waiting for the next person foolish enough to follow the light. My name is Oliver, and I've always been drawn to the eerie and unknown corners of the world. I used to visit remote places, seeking the kind of thrill that comes with uncovering the secrets others are too afraid to face. It was a winter trip to the old forest near my childhood home that would change everything. The forest had always been a place of mystery for me. As a child, I'd hear stories about it from the older local stories of strange happenings, people who went in and never came back, and trees that seemed to watch you. The locals called it the Hollow Grove, and even though I thought they were just stories, something about that forest always made my skin crawl. It had been years since I'd been back, but on a whim, I decided to return. The winter air was biting, and the landscape was covered with a thick blanket of snow. The trees, once towering and thick with leaves, now stood bare and skeletal. I walked deeper into the forest, following a faint trail I remembered from my childhood. As I ventured further, the forest grew quiet. The wind seemed to vanish, and there was no sound of animals or birds, just silence. It was unsettling. Then I came across something strange, a massive tree, hollow in the center, its trunk gnarled and twisted. The bark was blackened, as if scorched by some terrible fire. It looked ancient, older than the other trees in the forest, and it seemed to beckon me. I couldn't resist. I approached the tree and peered inside. The hollow space was dark, too dark for a tree's interior, as if it led somewhere deeper. My curiosity got the better of me, and I reached inside, feeling the cool, damp air that emanated from it. But something didn't feel right. There was a pull, an unseen force that made my hand tremble. Then, without warning, a hand grabbed mine from the darkness. I screamed, but no sound escaped my mouth. The hand was cold, unnaturally so, and it gripped me with a strength far greater than anything a human could possess. I tried to pull away, but it wouldn't let go. The hollow tree seemed to come alive around me, its roots shifting, its bark creaking like bones. "Oliver," a voice whispered from the darkness within the tree. It was a soft, gravelly voice, one that seemed to come from deep inside the earth itself. Panic surged through me as I tried to free myself, but the grip only tightened. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me from all directions, each voice speaking my name in unison, as if 1,000 souls were calling to me from the void. My heart raced, my breath shallow and quick, and I felt the coldness seeping into my very bones. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I looked down to see that the roots of the tree were slowly twisting around my legs, pulling me in. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was being dragged into the tree, its hollow interior like a gaping maw, ready to swallow me whole. "Please," I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips. "Let go." But the tree didn't answer. The hand was now joined by others, more hands, pale and gnarled, reaching out from the dark recesses of the hollow, their fingers like long twisted claws. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the grip loosened, and I fell backward, my body slamming into the snow. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The hollow tree stood still, its gaping trunk silent and empty. But the whispers didn't stop. They echoed in my mind, louder now, insistent, as if something still waited for me inside. I ran. I didn't look back. The forest seemed to close in. Around me, the trees bending in unnatural ways, their branches reaching toward me, as if trying to stop me from escaping. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I kept running, the sound of the whispers still lingering in my ears. I didn't dare return to that place, not after what I had felt. And every winter, when the snow covers the ground and the forest becomes quiet, I still hear those whispers calling me back to the hollow tree. My name is Harper, and I've always loved the woods. The quiet, the solitude, and the beauty of nature have always called to me. But one night, I found out there's a darkness in the forest that can't be seen. Only heard. It was an impromptu decision, taking a weekend trip into the forest alone. I had recently lost my job and needed an escape from the pressures of the city. I chose a remote area known as Pine Hollow, a place I had visited once as a child. The memories were fond, long days spent hiking, the smell of fresh pine, and the sounds of the wind through the trees. I didn't think anything could go wrong. I arrived at the forest late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The path into the woods was overgrown, but it was still passable. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple, and the air was crisp. I set up camp near a small creek, enjoying the peace and serenity of the forest. As night fell, the forest grew quieter. The sounds of birds and insects faded, and all that was left was the whisper of the wind through the pines. It was a sound I had always found soothing, but tonight it felt different. There was something wrong with the way the wind moved. It seemed to carry voices, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, the isolation of the woods can do that to a person. But the whispers grew louder as the night wore on, no longer a mere rustling, but actual words, low and distant, but unmistakable. Harper. I froze, my heart racing. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it was unmistakably my name. I stood up, scanning the trees around me. There was nothing there, no one, just the same dark expanse of trees stretching into the distance. Harper. The voice was closer this time, unmistakable in its clarity. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. Only the whispering pines, swaying gently in the night breeze. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal, though it didn't make sense. It didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent, until it sounded like it was right next to me. Come closer, Harper. I ran. I didn't stop to think. My legs carried me through the dark, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the trees. But the whispers followed me, always just behind, never too far. They beckoned me, coaxing me deeper into the forest. Don't run, Harper. We're waiting. I reached the creek, panting heavily, but the whispers didn't stop. They were all around me now, the pines shuddering as if in response to the voices. I stumbled to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps, feeling an overwhelming presence closing in. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I was free. But then, from behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves. I whipped around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Standing at the edge of the creek, just beyond the light's reach, was a figure, a man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that reflected the dim light like mirrors. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. Harper. His voice was a whisper, but this time it was not carried by the wind. It was right there, in my ears, like a breath on my skin. I ran again, faster this time, until my legs burned and my chest ached. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees finally broke apart and I saw the clearing. The man was gone, the whispers gone, but I knew they were still out there, waiting, listening. I never went back to Pine Hollow. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the pines near my home, I hear it again, the soft whisper of my name, carried on the wind. My name is Daniel, and I've always considered myself a seasoned hiker, but there are some trails in the forest that even experience can't prepare you for. This is the story of the Forgotten Trail, and what I encountered when I followed it. It all started on a trip to the mountains with a few friends. We'd been hiking for days, exploring the vast wilderness that surrounded us. We had all the right gear, maps, and supplies. Nothing could go wrong, or so we thought. One afternoon, As we were sitting by a stream to take a break, we noticed something strange. A narrow trail, almost hidden by overgrowth, seemed to appear out of nowhere. It wasn't on our map, and the other hikers we met along the way hadn't mentioned it. There was something about it that intrigued me. The others weren't so sure. "Let's stick to the marked paths," my friend Leah said, eyeing the trail warily. "We don't need to go exploring on our own." But I couldn't resist. I told them I'd be back soon, and decided to take the trail alone. I thought I'd find some hidden spot, maybe a secluded campsite, or a beautiful view, and return to the group later. It seemed harmless enough, after all. The trail was narrow, winding its way through dense trees and thick underbrush. As I walked deeper, I noticed the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The further I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of wildlife, birds chirping, insects buzzing faded away entirely. It felt as though the forest itself had fallen into a deep, unnatural silence. I kept walking, thinking I might have just gotten lost in the dense woods. But then I saw something odd, a set of footprints. They weren't human. They were too large, too wide. The prints led further into the woods, disappearing into the dense foliage. Curiosity pushed me forward, and I followed them. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I continued walking, the sense of unease growing with every step. It felt as though I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd hear something just beyond my vishuna, rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot. But when I looked around, there was never anything there. Hours passed, or so I thought. The sunlight dimmed, but the trail kept going. It seemed endless. Then, in the distance, I saw a small clearing up ahead. The moment I stepped into it, a cold chill ran down my spine. The clearing was unnaturally quiet, as though the very air was holding its breath. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the clearing was an old, weathered stone altar, covered in moss and vines. Surrounding it were strange markings, symbols carved into the ground. The atmosphere felt thick with something ancient, something dark. I should have turned around then, but something compelled me to step closer. As I approached the altar, a strange noise echoed in the air, low, guttural, like a growl. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned to leave, but the way I came was no longer visible. The trees had closed in, blocking the path I had taken. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard a voice, not from anywhere near, but deep within. My mind, it whispered my name, a voice like the wind, ancient and cold. "Daniel." The growl returned, louder now. I spun around to see something moving at the edge of the clearing. It was a figure, a shadow in the trees. Its eyes gleamed red in the dim light, and its long, twisted limbs stretched out toward me. I ran, but the forest seemed to shift around me. The trees closed in, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to give way. The trail I had followed was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, clawing at my mind, with no sense of direction. I stumbled blindly through the forest, the figure always just behind me. I didn't stop until I broke through the trees and into the open. The trail was gone. The darkness swallowed the forest behind me, and the whispers faded into silence. I never found my friends again. I couldn't explain what happened on that forgotten trail, but I know now that some paths are meant to stay lost. My name is Ethan, and I never believed in shadows, at least, not until I encountered one that wasn't mine. This is the story of the worst night of my life, spent in the heart of the forest. I had heard the rumors before, of course. The local hunters would mutter about the eerie happenings in the woods, but I thought they were just stories to spook city folk like me. So, when my friend Lucas invited me to join him on a camping trip deep in the forest, I figured it was a perfect opportunity to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of daily life. The forest was vast, its trees tall and ancient. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. We set up camp in a secluded clearing, far from any trail. It felt peaceful at first, but as night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. We sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, until the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, making the trees groan with every gust. That's when we noticed it's something moving in the darkness just beyond the firelight. At first we thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe, but then it moved. Too strangely, too deliberately. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else, entirely something that shifted with unnatural speed. "Did you see that?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with unease. I nodded. The shadow had moved again, closer this time. My heart started to race. We stood up, both of us instinctively reaching for our flashlights. But the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The forest was silent once again, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "That's not normal," Lucas muttered. "Let's pack up and leave." But I wasn't so sure. It was probably just a trick of the light, a misplaced branch swaying in the wind. We decided to stay for a little longer, but as we sat back down by the fire, the sense of unease grew. The shadow was still there, lurking just beyond the trees, its presence like a weight on our chests. We tried to laugh it off, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, the fire flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. My flashlight flickered on, but the beam barely cut through the thick blackness around us. And that's when we heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. "No," answered Dot. The footsteps continued, closer now, circling around us. We stood frozen, too scared to move. The shadow moved again, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. And then, in a flash, it lunged. It wasn't human. It was a figure, tall and slender, with elongated limbs and dark, hollow eyes. It moved with impossible speed, appearing right in front of us. I could feel its cold breath on my face as it loomed over me. I screamed and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor. I could hear Lucas behind me, but I dared not look back. The shadow was still there, following us, moving faster than any human could. The forest seemed to twist and warp as we ran, the trees bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, where the trees finally gave way to open land. Gasping for breath, we looked around, but there was no sign of the shadow. The forest was silent once more. We didn't speak a word as we packed up and left. That night still haunts me, and every time I close my eyes, I see the shadow moving among the trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. My name is Oliver, and I will never forget the day I ventured into the silent grove. The locals warned travelers about it, but I never believed in superstitions. That was my first mistake. I had been backpacking through the northern forests for days when I came across an old map at a small town shop. The map showed a hidden grove, marked with the words "silent" in faded ink. The storekeeper, an old man with a nervous twitch, warned me not to go. He said, "Some places are meant to stay hidden, son." But I shrugged it off. What could go wrong? That evening, I set off for the grove, eager for the adventure. The trail was overgrown, barely noticeable, but I pushed on, ignoring the increasing chill in the air. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. Birds stopped singing. The rustling of leaves ceased. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Finally, I arrived. The silent grove was a small clearing, surrounded by tall, dense trees. The ground was covered in thick moss, and there was a strange heaviness to the air. A feeling of dread settled in my stomach, but I chalked it up to the isolation. I set up camp, determined to make the most of the night. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the leaves behind me. When I turned to look, no one was there. The air grew heavier with each passing hour, until it felt almost suffocating. At around midnight, I heard a whisper, a soft voice, faint but distinct, calling my name, Oliver. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no one around. I was alone. Oliver. The voice was closer now. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, only trees and shadows. My heart pounded as I quickly packed up my things, ready to leave the grove and never look back. But before I could move, I felt it cold, hands on my shoulders, a grip that was ice-cold and strong. I spun around, but there was no one there. I ran. My heart raced as I stumbled through the dark, the whispering voices following me, always just out of reach. They echoed through the trees, calling my name over and over, growing louder with each step. Suddenly, I found myself back at the edge of the grove, where the trees seemed to part in a perfect line, as though guiding me out. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't even care where I was going, just as long as I was away from that cursed place. I never spoke of that night to anyone, and I'll never return to the silent grove, for I know now that some things are better left untouched. My name is James, and I've always been drawn to adventure, but one forest in particular will forever haunt me. It was supposed to be an easy weekend getaway, just a quiet camping trip with my brother, Luke, in the deep wood forest, a place known for its towering trees and untouched beauty. We arrived on Friday evening, setting up our campsite near an old, forgotten trail. There were no signs of life, no campers, just the deep silence of the forest. As we built our fire, I couldn't help but feel a strange pull to explore the old path we found earlier in the day. Something about it felt different, forbidden almost. Let's hike tomorrow, I suggested. I have a feeling there's something interesting back there. Luke was reluctant at first, but after some convincing, he agreed. The next morning, we set out early, following the trail deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser as we walked, and the sunlight grew scarce. After an hour of hiking, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a cabin. It was small, weathered by time, with vines creeping up its sides. It looked abandoned, untouched by time, and yet there was an unsettling energy around it. I don't like this, Luke muttered, but I was already making my way up the porch. The door creaked open, as if inviting me inside. Inside was a single room. Dust covered every surface, and an old stone fireplace sat at the center. But it was the walls that caught my attention. There were drawings, faded and eerie, etched into the wood. Faces, twisted and grotesque, eyes wide with fear. The drawings seemed to move if you stared at them too long. "James, we should go," Luke said, his voice trembling. "This place feels wrong." But I didn't listen. I was too curious, too fixated on the strange carvings. As I moved deeper into the cabin, the air grew thick, suffocating. I could hear faint whispers, low and urgent, like a warning. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped, heart racing. "Luke," I called, but there was no answer. Panic set in as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The cabin seemed to be alive, shifting, closing in around me. The whispering grew louder. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind me. I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. Man, thin and gaunt, his skin pale and drawn. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. I backed away, heart pounding. My vision blurred as the whispers turned into screams all around me. The man reached out, his fingers long and skeletal. I tried to run, but the walls seemed to close in on me, trapping me. Just as I was about to lose hope, the door flung open. Luke stood there, wide-eyed and terrified. He grabbed my arm and pulled me outside, back into the woods. We didn't speak as we hurried back to camp. The whispers lingered in my ears, and every step we took felt heavier than the last. When we reached our campsite, the sun was setting, but something was off. The forest felt different, darker, colder. We decided to leave immediately, packing up and driving back without a word. I've never returned to Deepwood Forest, and I never will. That cabin, those eyes, the whispering, it's still with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see those faces, etched into the walls, waiting for someone to make the same mistake we did. My name is Sarah, and I was never one to believe in old folk tales, especially not the ones about the Black Forest. It's a vast stretch of wilderness, dense and untouched, filled with ancient trees and hidden dangers. But nothing prepared me for what I would encounter on my solo hike through its heart. I had always been drawn to nature, and after hearing so many people rave about the peace and beauty of Black Forest, I decided to go on a solo trip to test my limits. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I figured, what could go wrong? A little hike, a few days of camping, and some solitude. That's all I wanted. The first day went well. The weather was perfect, the forest quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I found a secluded spot near a small stream, set up my tent, and settled in. As the sun began to set, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The forest seemed to come alive with soft whispers in the wind. But as night fell, something changed. The air grew colder, heavier, and I could hear something in the distance howling, but not like any animal I had ever heard. It was more like a wail, a mournful sound that echoed through the trees. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, but it was getting closer. I told myself it was just the wind, playing tricks, so I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The howling continued, growing louder, more insistent. I curled up in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight, unsure whether to investigate or stay in my tent. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The trees began to sway, their branches creaking and groaning under the pressure. Then I heard it again, closer. This time, much closer. A voice, not human, calling to me from the darkness. Sarah, ... Come to me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This was no animal. This was something else. Something ancient. The wind howled louder, and the voice repeated, this time with more urgency. Sarah, come to me. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, but I pushed forward, drawn by the voice. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of shadows. The howling was deafening now. I couldn't understand where it was coming from, but I felt it in my bones, a presence lurking just beyond my reach. I called out into the darkness, hoping for an answer, but all I heard was the wind, growing louder, as if it were mocking me. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something moving in the underbrush. I turned quickly, but the moment I did, the howling stopped. A dead silence fell over the forest. For a long moment, I stood there, breathing heavily, unsure of what to do next. Then I saw a figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the tree line. It was barely visible in the moonlight, but I could make out its long, spindly arms reaching towards me. It didn't move. It just watched me, its eyes gleaming like stars in the dark. Sarah, it whispered again. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away. The howling returned, but now it was a chorus of voices, all calling my name, all reaching for me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found my way back to the edge of the forest. I collapsed, gasping for air, my heart racing. The voices faded, the howling died down, and the wind settled. I never finished my hike. I never returned to that forest. The howling still haunts me to this day, and every time the wind picks up, I swear I can still hear it calling my name. My name is Ethan, and I'll never forget the summer trip that changed everything. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods, but what I experienced out there is something I will carry with me forever. I was with my two friends, Mike and Emma. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, and finally, we made our way to Blackwood Forest. Known for its thick canopy and quiet, isolated trails, the park rangers had warned us that the forest was vast and it could get disorienting, but we thought nothing of it. We were seasoned campers, after all. The first night was peaceful. We set up our tents, lit a fire, and told stories beneath the stars. The moon was full, and everything felt surreal, the kind of perfect wilderness night you see in movies. As the fire died down, we settled into our tents, ready for the next day's hike. That's when the odd things started happening. Around midnight, I was awoken by a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or chirping of animals. It was a slow, deliberate tapping, like someone was knocking on the trees. I tried to shake it off as an animal, but then I heard it again, closer this time, and with a faint whisper attached to it. Double quotes, Ethan, ... double quotes, the voice seemed to say. It was so faint, I wondered if I was dreaming. I lay still in my tent, holding my breath. The tapping continued, moving along the trees, as if someone was walking in the woods just outside our camp. I decided to go check, thinking maybe it was Mike or Emma playing a prank on me. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped my tent, and stepped out. There was no one around. The woods were still. The only sound was the wind brushing against the leaves, but as I stood there, I felt a sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I returned to my tent, but sleep didn't come. I kept hearing the tapping, coming from different directions now, always getting closer. And every time I heard it, I could swear I heard a faint whisper of my name. The next morning, Mike and Emma were awake and ready to go. They didn't mention anything about hearing strange sounds. I was about to bring it up when I noticed something strange. Our campsite was completely undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of animals, nothing. We hiked deeper into the woods, but every time we stopped, I could sense something was following us. The trees seemed to close in on us, and the wind grew louder, like something was moving just out of sight. I kept hearing the tapping, always behind me, always in the distance, but closer than before. That evening, when we returned to camp, I noticed something terrifying. High in the trees, barely visible, were dark figures. They weren't animals, not even birds. They were human-shaped figures, watching us from the branches. I could barely see them, but I could feel their eyes on me, on us. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mike and Emma turned around, but when they looked up, the figures were gone. "We're not alone here," I whispered, my throat dry. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time, almost like a drum beat. The whispers followed me into my tent, echoing around me, until I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. When morning came, we packed up in a hurry. We left Blackwood Forest without looking back. I'll never know what was out there, who was watching us from the trees, but I know this. Something was waiting for us. Something ancient and malevolent. The tapping still haunts me, and every now and then I hear a whisper, as if the forest is calling my name.